When the homeowner first stepped into the neighborhood, the place looked calm, almost too calm. The kind of quiet that makes people imagine a peaceful life, where everyone minds their own business and the streets stay clean because people take pride in their homes. That was exactly what the homeowner wanted. After years of saving, planning, and dreaming of a place that felt like a fresh start, this community seemed perfect. Neat lawns, houses lined up in soft colors, and neighbors who waved from a distance. It felt like the right place to settle in and finally breathe. The homeowner had heard of HOAs before, but never dealt with one personally. All that came to mind were stories people shared at family gatherings. Some good, some bad, many exaggerated. So when the HOA sent a welcome letter with warm words and a little booklet explaining community guidelines, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt more like a handshake. The homeowner read everything carefully, wanting to start things off right. There were rules, sure, but nothing unusual. Keep your lawn trimmed. Don't block sidewalks. Get approval before adding major structures. Standard stuff. For the first few weeks, life fit into place smoothly. Boxes were unpacked, furniture found its spot, and the daily routine began to steady. Every morning, the homeowner would take a short walk down the street, noticing new details about the neighborhood. The sound of a fountain from a nearby yard, a neighbor walking a small dog, a kid across the street learning to ride a bike. It felt like a community that had settled into itself long before the homeowner arrived. But the first sign of trouble came quietly. It was just a letter in the mailbox, slipped between a few flyers and a delivery package. The homeowner opened it casually at the kitchen table while sipping morning tea. It wasn't angry or harsh, just a notice saying the grass seemed slightly overgrown and needed trimming. That surprised the homeowner because the lawn had been cut less than a week earlier. It still looked fresh. But mistakes happen, and maybe the inspector came by before the lawn service showed up. So the homeowner shrugged it off and cut the grass again just to avoid any issue. Another week passed. This time the notice mentioned something else. A trash can left in view after pickup day. The homeowner walked outside to check and found the bin tucked where it always was, behind a wooden panel next to the garage. It wasn't visible from the street unless someone walked right up to the driveway and leaned over. The homeowner started feeling uneasy, but tried to stay calm. Maybe the HOA was just very particular. Maybe they had a system that wasn't always accurate. A third notice came soon after, and this one felt more personal. There was something unusual about the tone. It mentioned a failure to maintain the uniform appearance of the community, and pointed to small decorative items placed near the front door. The homeowner frowned because these decorative items were simply two small planters with green plants inside plants that had been there since day one. Countless neighbors had similar decorations. It didn't make sense. The homeowner walked around the block, pretending it was just a casual stroll, but really studying other houses. Some had statues, some had larger planters, some had things far more noticeable, but none of them seemed to have a problem. That's when the homeowner noticed something even more telling. Some neighbors glanced away quickly, like they didn't want to be caught looking. Others gave polite smiles. But not the warm kind, more like the kind people give when they know something but don't want to say it. Eventually, while walking back home, one neighbor who looked older and more relaxed waved the homeowner over. He spoke softly, almost like he didn't want anyone to hear. "Don't take those letters too hard," he said. "They do that to everyone new." The homeowner, confused, asked what he meant. The man took a breath and explained that the HOA had a habit of testing new residents. They watched closely, sent more notices than necessary, tried to see how easily someone would follow rules without questioning them. The man whispered that some people in the past had gotten so overwhelmed they eventually moved out. It felt strange hearing that. It didn't match the peaceful image the neighborhood gave off. But the man's expression wasn't exaggerated or dramatic. It was the expression of someone who had seen this happen before. The homeowner thanked him and went home uneasy. That night, instead of relaxing, the homeowner read through every rule in the HOA booklet again. Nothing matched the claims in the notices. Nothing said small planters were a violation. Nothing said the trash bin area needed to be invisible from every angle. Something wasn't right. The next morning, the homeowner emailed the HOA politely, asking for clarification about the violations. No argument, no challenge, just a request for more details. The reply came back quickly, but without any real explanation. It simply restated the claims, almost word for word, like a template message. That felt odd. Days later, another notice arrived. This one claimed there was noise during restricted hours. Homeowner nearly laughed because the house was quiet, especially at night. No parties, no loud music, no guests. It didn't make sense at all. The homeowner stepped outside again that evening and noticed two people standing near a parked car across the street. One held a clipboard. They weren't talking. They weren't inspecting anything else. They were just staring at the homeowner's house. That moment quiet, strange and unsettling made something inside the homeowner click. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a strict HOA following rules. It felt like they were looking for reasons to create pressure, to intimidate, or to test how far they could push. Instead of letting fear take over, the homeowner decided to stay calm and observant. Every letter, every notice, every email reply was saved and printed. Photos of the front yard, lawn, trash bin area, and porch were taken daily with timestamps. If the HOA wanted to turn this into a challenge, the homeowner would not panic. They would prepare. One evening, while taking a walk, the homeowner noticed another neighbor sitting outside on the porch. This neighbor had lived there for years and seemed friendly. The homeowner asked quietly if he had ever received strange notices. The man looked around before answering, almost checking for unseen ears. He said the HOA board had a few people who were extremely controlling. They liked power. They liked to show authority. And most people didn't fight back, so the board kept pushing boundaries. Sometimes they used rules incorrectly. Sometimes they twisted them. The neighbor said he had once questioned a fine, and things only got worse, so he paid it just to avoid trouble. The homeowner asked why no one reported it or stood up to it. The man sighed and said, "Most folks don't want conflict. They just want to live quietly. But that only encourages them." That night, the homeowner thought deeply. This was supposed to be a peaceful home. This was supposed to be a fresh start. But now it felt like walking into a quiet storm where everything looked normal on the outside, but something darker was going on underneath. Still, the homeowner wasn't someone who backed down easily. Instead of losing sleep, the homeowner made a decision. If the HOA wanted to push, the homeowner would push back, but in the right way, calmly, smartly, legally. There would be no yelling, no dramatic confrontations. Just facts, proof, and patience. The next morning, the homeowner went to the HOA office in person, hoping to speak directly and resolve things peacefully. But the moment the homeowner walked in, it was obvious the board members weren't interested in a friendly talk. They acted distant, dismissive, and almost annoyed by the presence of someone who dared to ask questions. One board member barely looked up while speaking. Another kept typing as if the conversation was an inconvenience. When the homeowner asked why the notices kept coming without explanation, they responded with vague statements about community standards and visual harmony. When the homeowner asked to see proof or inspection records, they said those were internal documents. The homeowner left the meeting feeling surprised, but not defeated. If anything, the strange behavior only confirmed that something was off. On the way home, the homeowner tried to think of every detail that had happened in the past month. Every letter, every look from neighbors, every board member's reaction, and one thing became clear. This wasn't just about grass or trash cans or planters. This was about control. The homeowner was not the kind of person who enjoyed conflict. But there was a strong sense of fairness inside. The idea of being pushed around by people misusing their authority didn't sit well. And if they were doing this to the homeowner, they were probably doing it to others who didn't know their rights. So the homeowner decided to learn. Really learn. That night, instead of watching TV or relaxing, the homeowner sat with a laptop and searched for information about HOA rules, state laws, and homeowner protections. Hours passed. Articles, forums, legal guides, everything was studied. By the end of the night, the homeowner had learned more about HOA regulations than most people ever would. The next week, when another notice arrived claiming the lawn still wasn't up to community expectations, The homeowner smiled, not out of amusement, but because this time, everything was documented. Every blade of grass, every part of the yard, every time-stamped photo, instead of ignoring the notice. The homeowner wrote a calm but firm reply, asking for clarification and citing exact sections of the HOA's own rulebook. It was polite but impossible to dismiss. For the first time, the HOA didn't reply immediately. The homeowner didn't know it yet. But this was the moment everything began to shift. This was the moment the HOA realized they had chosen the wrong person to target someone who didn't get scared, didn't crumble, and didn't give up. Someone who was ready to stand up. And though the homeowner didn't know the full story yet, this was only the beginning of the battle that would change everything in the neighborhood. The next few weeks in the neighborhood felt different for the homeowner. There was a change in the air, something subtle but noticeable. People watched more closely. The HOA board seemed unusually alert. And every time the homeowner stepped outside, it felt like unseen eyes were studying every small movement. Even small things, watering plants, sweeping the porch, or simply taking the trash to the curb felt like they were being observed. The homeowner tried not to overthink it. But another letter in the mailbox made it impossible to ignore the feeling. This time, the notice said that unapproved modifications had been made to the side of the house. The homeowner stood there reading the paper slowly, completely puzzled. Nothing had been changed. Nothing had even been touched since moving in. The paint was the same. The lights were the same. The windows and trim were exactly as they had always been. It didn't make sense. The homeowner stepped outside and walked slowly around the property, checking every corner. Nothing was out of place. Nothing matched what the notice claimed. So the homeowner took photos again, each one time-stamped. Then the homeowner sat at the kitchen table, took a breath, and wrote a calm message asking the HOA to explain what part of the home had been modified. The reply came the next day, and it was even stranger than the claim itself. The email said the board did not need to provide specifics unless necessary, that the homeowner should review the community standards to ensure compliance. It was vague in a way that felt intentional, like they were trying to make the homeowner guess what they might be referring to. For a moment, the homeowner felt a rush of frustration, but instead of reacting emotionally, the homeowner reminded themselves of the plan. Stay calm, gather proof, and never give them an excuse to twist anything. That same afternoon, while the homeowner was taking photos around the house for documentation, a neighbor slowly walked over. She was holding a small gardening tool and wearing gloves, as if she had been working outside. Her voice was gentle, almost hesitant. "I heard you had a meeting with the board," she said quietly. "They don't like when people ask for explanations." The homeowner raised an eyebrow and asked why. The woman glanced around, making sure no one else was nearby. She explained that the board had been known to target people who questioned them. They would issue more violations, sometimes for things that didn't exist. They would make life difficult until the person either paid the fines or stopped pushing back. The homeowner listened carefully, noticing the worry on the woman's face. She said the board had once even tried to fine her for the color of her fence. Even though the fence was the same color as every other fence in the community, she had ended up repainting it just to avoid further trouble. The homeowner thanked her and walked back inside, feeling even more certain that the HOA was not following its own rules. Something was happening here that didn't match what an HOA was supposed to be. It didn't feel like they were protecting property values or keeping the neighborhood nice. It felt more like they were testing boundaries in, using fear to stay in control. The next notice came faster than the others. Only 3 days had passed before another envelope appeared. Inside, the HOA accused the homeowner of non-compliant landscaping again. But this time, the notice came with a fine attached. It was the first fine the homeowner had received. And it stung not because of the money, but because it was clear the board had escalated things. They weren't just sending warnings anymore. They were trying to push. The homeowner sat down and reread the notice carefully. Then the homeowner pulled out the HOA rulebook. The same one sent with the welcome packet and flipped through the landscaping section. There was nothing that matched the claim. Nothing that justified a fine. The lawn was trimmed, The plants were approved. There were no weeds, no overgrown areas. Everything was documented with photos. The homeowner's hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that the board had crossed a line. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about power. Instead of panicking, the homeowner got to work. A detailed reply was written, attaching photos from the same day the notice claimed a violation occurred. The homeowner cited exact lines from the HOA's own rules, showing no violation existed. The message also politely requested that the fine be removed unless the HOA could provide factual proof of the issue. 2 days passed with no response, then a letter, not an email, arrived. This one wasn't a simple notice. It was a formal letter from the HOA president, written in a cold, distant tone. The letter said that questioning the board's decisions was unproductive, and that homeowners were expected to cooperate with community leadership. It also stated that repeated requests for proof could be considered disruptive behavior. The homeowner stared at the paper in disbelief. Asking for proof was now considered disruptive? For the first time since moving to the neighborhood, the homeowner felt anger rising, slow, steady, and controlled. It wasn't the kind of anger that leads someone to yell or slam doors. It was the kind that made the homeowner more focused than ever. If they wanted a quiet target, they had picked the wrong person. The homeowner spent the rest of the evening organizing every single letter, every photo, every message. A folder was created, both physical and digital, containing everything. The homeowner knew that from this point forward, every interaction had to be documented. The next morning, things took another strange turn. While checking the mailbox, the homeowner noticed a man walking slowly by with a clipboard. He pretended to be looking at houses across the street, but his eyes kept drifting toward the homeowner's lawn. The homeowner nodded politely, but the man didn't respond. He kept staring and writing something down. The homeowner walked back inside and peered through a window. The man continued walking, looking back at the house more than once. It wasn't paranoia. It was deliberate. Later that day, another neighbor stopped by. He seemed nervous, glancing back and forth as he spoke. "You should be careful," he said quietly. One of the board members drives around early in the morning taking pictures of people's homes before sunrise. They say it's for inspections, but nobody ever agreed to that. The homeowner thanked him and realized something very important. The HOA wasn't just strict. They were watching people closely, much too closely. That evening, the homeowner sat at the computer again. This time, the research went deeper. State laws were examined. Articles about HOA abuse of power were read. Examples of improper fines, harassment cases, and legal protections were studied. The homeowner learned that state law required HOAs to maintain detailed inspection records. They were also required to provide proof of violations if asked. And most importantly, they were not allowed to intimidate homeowners for asking questions. Everything the HOA had been doing went against multiple rules. With new knowledge, the homeowner wrote a clear and calm reply to the HOA president's letter. The message politely stated that the homeowner would be requesting copies of inspection records under state law. The homeowner also asked for clarification on the board's policies regarding fines and documentation. All questions were stated simply, no emotion. No argument, just clear requests backed by the law. The HOA did not respond. Days passed. A week went by. Nothing. But something else did happen. More neighbors started noticing the situation. Some nodded encouragingly when the homeowner passed by. Others whispered quietly during evening walks. A few even shared their own stories, fines for things that weren't violations, warnings without proof, intimidation during meetings. The more the homeowner listened, the more it became clear the HOA had been doing this for years. People were simply too tired, too busy, or too scared to fight back. But the homeowner wasn't scared. Not anymore. The next HOA notice came early on a Saturday morning. It claimed that the homeowner had refused to comply with previous warnings and that further consequences could follow. But this time something different happened. The homeowner took the letter, placed it neatly on the table, and began writing the most detailed email so far. It referenced specific laws, It listed dates and times of previous requests. It included photos showing no violations. And it politely stated that unless the HOA provided proof, the homeowner would consider the matter unresolved on their end. Within an hour, the HOA sent a short reply. "We will review your concerns." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an explanation. But it was the first time they didn't respond with hostility. The tone had changed. They were cautious. Something inside the homeowner shifted after that email. The fear was gone. The stress was there, yes, but beneath it was a calm confidence. Every step the HOA took only made the homeowner more prepared. Every false claim only made the homeowner stronger. One day the homeowner walked outside and caught the same clipboard man staring at the property again. But this time the homeowner walked right up to him and said, in a polite tone, "If you're inspecting something, can you show me what you're looking at?" He froze. He mumbled something about taking routine notes and hurried away. The homeowner watched him go, realizing that even the board members weren't used to anyone pushing back. They were used to people shrinking, apologizing, or paying to avoid trouble. But the homeowner wasn't going anywhere. That evening, the homeowner printed out a fresh set of photos and added them to the growing folder. At this point, the folder was thick enough to slap onto a table with a loud thud. The homeowner didn't know when it would be needed, but it felt important to keep gathering everything because deep down, the homeowner sensed something big was coming. The HOA had escalated too quickly. They had become too aggressive. And people who misuse power rarely stop on their own. They push until someone pushes back harder. And now, for the first time in a long time, the homeowner felt ready not just to defend themselves, but to reveal the truth behind everything happening in that quiet neighborhood with clean lawns and fake smiles. The HOA had started something, and they were about to learn they chose the wrong person to mess with. In the days that followed, the homeowner felt a strange mix of calm and focus. There was no fear anymore, just a growing sense of determination. Something had shifted inside, something steady and unshakable. The HOA kept pushing, but each time they did, the homeowner grew stronger and more sure of the path ahead. It wasn't about fighting for pride or attention. It was simply about standing up for what was right, not just for themselves, but for anyone else who might be dealing with the same pressure silently. The morning after the email exchange, the homeowner stepped outside early to water the plants. The neighborhood was quiet, still wrapped in the soft light of sunrise. That's when another neighbor approached one who had barely spoken a word since the homeowner moved in. He walked slowly, holding a cup of coffee, and stopped near the edge of the lawn. "I heard what happened," he said quietly. The homeowner nodded. Unsure how much he actually knew, he continued, "You don't have to tell me details, but I'll say this. No one has ever pushed back like you're doing. Most people try once, maybe twice, then give up. You're different." His words weren't loud, but they carried weight. They felt like a small piece of truth the homeowner hadn't fully realized until now. The man sighed deeply, looking down the street toward the HOA office. "They get away with a lot because people don't want trouble. But they've made life hard for families here. I once got a notice for having a garden hose out. A hose, it wasn't even in the way. They just wanted to remind me who was in charge." The homeowner listened carefully, absorbing every detail. The more stories people shared, the clearer the entire pattern became. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood clean or organized. It wasn't about rules or community standards. It was about control, plain and simple. The homeowner thanked him and continued watering the plants, feeling more aware of how much this situation had impacted everyone else. It wasn't just their story anymore, even if the homeowner didn't want it. They had stepped into a role that others had been hoping someone would take for years. Later that afternoon, the homeowner organized all the documents again, making sure everything was in order. Photos, letters, emails, each one had its place in the growing file. There was something comforting about the neat rows of evidence. Not because the homeowner wanted to use it against anyone, but because truth was a sturdy thing to hold on to. In the middle of this organizing, an email alert popped up. It was from the HOA. The message was short, almost stiff. "We acknowledge receipt of your request and are reviewing your concerns. It wasn't much, but it was different. The board wasn't pushing back as aggressively this time. They weren't ignoring the homeowner or sending warnings. For the first time, they sounded careful. But even though the HOA's tone had shifted, the homeowner still felt uneasy. It didn't seem like they were backing down. It felt more like they were planning something quietly. They were too used to having power. They wouldn't give that up easily. That weekend, something unexpected happened. A group of 3 neighbors gathered near the homeowner's driveway. They didn't knock or call out. They just stood there talking softly among themselves, occasionally glancing toward the house. The homeowner stepped outside and approached them, wondering what had brought them there. One of them spoke first.
"We wanted to talk to you about the HOA." Another chimed in. "We've all been fined or warned unfairly too."
We've all tried speaking up, but nothing changed. The third neighbor, a soft-spoken person who seemed more anxious than the others, whispered, "But you're doing something different. You actually make them respond." The homeowner shook their head gently, saying, "I'm just asking for proof. Just asking them to follow their own rules." "That's exactly why they don't like you," one neighbor said with a small smile. "They don't know how to handle someone who won't just accept whatever they say." They shared several stories, lost appeals. Fines without evidence, ignored complaints. Even shouted comments during HOA meetings. It was shocking how much people had endured without anyone stepping in to help. The homeowner listened carefully, asking questions, writing down details. Patterns were forming. The same board members' names kept coming up. The same vague rule violations. The same dismissive replies. At some point, one neighbor asked, "So what are you going to do now?" They won't stop. Not unless they're forced to. The homeowner didn't have a plan yet, but the answer came naturally. "I'm going to keep asking for proof. I'll keep everything documented. If they follow their rules, fine. If they don't, well then I'll go higher." The neighbors exchanged hopeful looks. One of them even said, "You have no idea how long this neighborhood has waited for someone like you." The homeowner didn't know how to respond to that. It was a big thing to hear, but deep down, it felt right. They weren't fighting just for themselves anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had stayed quiet because they didn't know what else to do. The next week, Yaz's behavior grew even stranger. No new notices arrived, but the homeowner noticed unusual activity around the neighborhood. A board member's car drove by the house almost every evening. Someone walked by twice a day, pretending to look at landscaping, but always glancing toward the homeowner's yard. A man with a camera phone lingered for several minutes on the sidewalk. One afternoon, it felt like the HOA was gathering something, maybe trying to find a new angle. But the homeowner had nothing to hide. Everything was clean, well kept, and within every rule listed in the book. Still, the homeowner documented everything. Photos, videos, notes, times, dates. Not out of fear, but out of preparation. If the board wanted a fight, the homeowner would fight with truth and proof. Nothing more then came the moment that truly changed everything. On a Wednesday morning, after finishing breakfast, the homeowner opened the mailbox and found a new letter from the HOA. The envelope was thicker than usual, which was never a good sign. The homeowner took it inside, sat at the table, and opened it carefully. Inside was a formal notice accusing the homeowner of repeated noncompliance and stating that the board was considering further action. They still didn't provide any proof. There were no photos, no details, no dates. Just another vague accusation wrapped in official-sounding language. But this time, the letter mentioned something new, a scheduled meeting with the board to discuss ongoing concerns. The homeowner read it twice, then a third time. They weren't backing down. They were doubling down. For a long moment, the homeowner sat in silence. There was no anger this time, just a deep, solid resolve. The HOA had crossed a line by suggesting action without evidence. They were trying to intimidate, hoping the homeowner would panic or back away. But instead of fear, something else rose inside: clarity. The homeowner got to work immediately. Every document was organized. Every message was lined up. Every photo was printed with dates in the corner. A full summary was written, describing everything that had happened since moving in. The homeowner even reached out to a neighbor who seemed particularly knowledgeable about legal matters. They didn't ask for formal help, just wanted to check if their understanding of state HOA laws was correct. The neighbor confirmed everything. The homeowner was well within their rights. The HOA was not. The day of the meeting approached quickly. On the morning of the meeting, homeowner woke up early, feeling calm, more calm than expected. There was something empowering about walking into a room knowing the truth was on your side. The homeowner wasn't looking for a fight, it's just fairness. When the homeowner entered the board meeting, the room had a strange quietness. The board members sat at a long table, trying to look official. The HOA president sat in the center, looking firm but not confident, more like someone trying to hide uncertainty. "Thank you for coming," the president said. The homeowner nodded and placed the neatly organized folder on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood made a few heads lift. One board member asked, "Do you understand why you're here?" The homeowner replied calmly, "I'm here because you sent me a letter with claims you haven't been able to support." The board members exchanged quick glances. They didn't expect that answer. The homeowner continued, "Speaking clearly, I've asked several times for proof of violations, but every time I received vague statements. No photos, no dates, no explanations. I brought my own documentation." The board looked uneasy. The homeowner opened the folder and slid a stack of photos forward, each one time stamped, showing the property in full compliance. "This is the condition of my home on the dates you claimed violations. If you have evidence of an issue, I'm happy to see it." There was silence. Heavy silence. The HOA president cleared his throat and said, "We'll need time to review your documents." The homeowner nodded, then said the words that would change everything. "I've also reviewed state law. If you continue issuing false violations or fines without evidence, I'll need to file a formal complaint." The room froze. The homeowner wasn't yelling, wasn't angry, just calmly stating facts. And that's what made it powerful. One board member shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Another avoided eye contact. It was obvious they hadn't expected the homeowner to know the lore. To document everything so carefully, the president finally said, "We'll take this under review." The homeowner collected the folder and stood. "Thank you. Please send me any future concerns with proof." And with that, the homeowner left the room. Walking out felt like walking out of a storm and into open air. The fight wasn't over, far from it, but something important had happened. The board finally realized the homeowner wasn't someone they could push around. They weren't someone who would give up or hide. They were someone who stood up, calmly and confidently. That evening, several neighbors stood outside waiting. They didn't know what had happened, but they could tell the meeting had been important. When the homeowner told them everything, their reactions were a mix of relief and quiet excitement. Some even smiled for the first time in weeks. One neighbor said, "You're doing what none of us could." Another whispered, "This could finally change things." The homeowner didn't feel like a hero, just someone who refused to be bullied. Someone who believed rules should be fair. Someone who believed people deserved better. But deep inside, the feeling was growing something strong, steady, and ready for whatever came next. Because the HOA had pushed, and pushed, and pushed. And now they were about to learn that they had truly picked the wrong person to mess with. The next few weeks felt like walking through a quiet storm. Nothing looked different in the neighborhood, and people still waved politely when they passed by. But something had changed. The resident could sense it. The HOA board, after realizing their usual tricks weren't working, had become strangely silent. That silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the kind that comes right before trouble shows up again. The resident didn't stop preparing. Every evening after work, they sat at the kitchen table with their laptop, reviewing every notice and email the HOA had ever sent. They had already organized everything in folders, including photos, dates, and copies of the bylaws. At first it had felt overwhelming, but now there was a strange sense of calm in doing it. The more they learned, the more confident they felt. One morning, a new letter arrived. It was another warning, this time accusing the resident of violating community landscaping standards. The letter claimed that the bushes and the Front yard were not trimmed to acceptable. Uniformity. The resident stared at the paper, then looked out the window. The bushes were trimmed neatly 2 days ago. In fact, they looked better than most shrubs on the street. This wasn't about bushes. This wasn't about rules. This was the board taking one last shot, hoping to intimidate the resident into giving up. Instead of getting angry, the resident took out their phone and snapped photos from multiple angles. Then they opened the HOA's own landscaping guidelines. There was no rule about uniformity. There wasn't even a rule about the height of bushes, unless they blocked sidewalks or driveways, which they didn't. That evening, the resident wrote a calm and detailed response. It wasn't emotional. It simply explained that the bushes met the guidelines and attached the photos as proof. The letter also requested the board to cite the exact bylaw they believed was being violated. The reply was short and cold. "We will review this further." This time, the resident didn't feel nervous. They just felt tired. Tired of the games, tired of the petty accusations, and tired of people in positions of power who acted like bullies. The whole situation felt unnecessary, and yet it wasn't unusual. As they learned from talking to neighbors, the board had been using these tactics for years. A few days later, a neighbor stopped by. He was an older man, quiet and kind, someone who kept to himself. He carried a small stack of papers in his hand. "I heard what the board is doing to you," he said softly. "I thought you should see this." Inside the papers were old notices the HOA had given him, some almost identical to the ones the resident had received. The neighbor explained how he had also tried to fight back, but didn't know the laws. He didn't know where to start, and eventually paid the fines just to avoid stress. He told the resident in a low voice, "You're the first person I've seen stand up to them this strongly." The resident thanked him, touched by the gesture. It made everything feel even more real. This wasn't just about one homeowner. The board had been pushing people around for years because no one had pushed back. Maybe the resident didn't set out to fight for the whole neighborhood, but that's what they were slowly doing. One evening, while organizing documents, the resident realized something strange in the HOA's financial reports, or rather the lack of reports. Every HOA was supposed to share financial documents with homeowners upon request. But when the resident had asked for them earlier, the board had delayed, then ignored the request. Under state law, refusing to show financial records was a serious issue. The resident sent another formal request, this time referencing the law directly. The board now had a deadline to respond, and the clock was ticking. As the days passed, the neighborhood started changing. People began stopping by more often. Some offered quiet support. Others shared their own stories. A family down the street talked about being fined for a non-existent noise violation, a single mother said. The board sent her threatening letters about a parking violation, even though her car was parked in her assigned spot. It became clear that the board wasn't just strict, they were unfair and inconsistent, using rules to scare people instead of protecting the community. The residents started gathering statements. It's not as ammunition, but as clarity. The more stories they heard, the more they realized the HOA didn't just need a reminder, they needed accountability. Then came the moment that changed everything. At the next HOA community meeting, the resident showed up early. The room was a simple space with folding chairs and a long table up front where the board usually sat. The lighting was dim and the air felt heavy. Like everyone inside knew something was coming. Slowly, neighbors filled the room. Many had never attended a meeting before, but this time they did. They sat quietly at first, looking around, murmuring to each other. When the board members finally entered, they seemed visibly uneasy. Maybe they weren't expecting this many people. Maybe they weren't expecting people to finally pay attention. The president of the board cleared his throat and started with the usual agenda. Landscaping updates, maintenance schedules, a reminder about holiday decorations. He spoke quickly, as if he wanted to rush through everything before anyone had a chance to speak. But the resident waited patiently until the end, when open homeowner discussion began. The room fell silent as the resident stood up. They held a folder in their hand not as a weapon, but as proof. I want to talk about the violation notices I've been receiving, the resident said calmly. And not just mine. Many people here have been dealing with the same issues. Board members shifted uncomfortably. If you have concerns, you can send them to us in writing. I have. Many times, and you haven't answered. The resident opened the folder and laid out copies of the letters, photos, and emails. Every accusation you've made has been disproven. But that isn't the bigger problem. Several neighbors nodded. The room was quiet, but not empty quiet like a waiting room right before the truth comes out. The resident continued, I requested financial documents from the HOA weeks ago. State law gives homeowners the right to see them. You refused? That's not just unfair. It's illegal. A wave of whispers spread across the room. Even people who didn't know the law understood the seriousness of that word. One board member tried to interrupt, but the resident didn't raise their voice or argue. They simply kept speaking with calm confidence. I'm not here to fight. I'm here because this community deserves honesty. People pay dues. People follow rules. But the board hasn't been transparent with us, and many of us have been treated unfairly because of it. A neighbor stood up. They fined me for something I didn't do. Another spoke up. They ignored my requests for repairs for months. Someone else said, I moved here for peace, not stress. The room grew louder, not angry, but relieved. People were finally speaking after years of feeling unheard. The board tried to regain control, telling homeowners the discussion was out of order, but no one listened. Not because people were disrespectful, but because they were tired of being silenced. The resident waited again for quiet. Then they said the words that changed everything. I've already filed a formal complaint with the state regarding the refusal to share financial records. They contacted me last week. They will be auditing the HOA. The board froze. You could practically hear the sound of panic in the room. They weren't expecting an audit. They weren't expecting anyone to go beyond complaining. They certainly weren't expecting someone who actually knew the law. The entire room shifted. Neighbors looked at each other, realizing this wasn't just a small argument anymore. It was much bigger. The truth was about to come out, and the board couldn't stop it. The meeting ended in chaos, but not because of shouting. It ended because people wanted answers, and the board no longer had the power to keep everyone quiet. Homeowners walked out together, talking, sharing stories, asking questions. For the first time, they felt unified. That night, the resident walked home with a strange feeling, not fear, but relief. The weight that had been building for weeks finally felt lighter. This wasn't over yet, but the turning point had come. The truth was out in the open, and the board couldn't hide from it anymore. In the following days, things changed quickly. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now stopped by to ask for updates. People who had feared the board now felt braver, knowing they weren't alone. The neighborhood felt different, still quiet, still peaceful on the outside. But filled with a sense of growing hope, the resident didn't celebrate. They knew the real battle was coming. The audit wasn't just a formality. It would reveal everything the board had been hiding. And once the truth came out, the community would finally understand why things had felt so wrong for so long. But for now, the resident rested, grateful that the hardest part, taking the first big stand, was done. The board had pushed people around for years, but they had finally picked the wrong person to mess with, and the consequences were about to catch up with them. The days that followed the community meeting felt strangely calm, almost like the neighborhood was taking a deep breath after holding it for too long. People still walked their dogs in the morning, kids still rode their bikes down the sidewalk, and sprinklers still clicked on at sunset. But underneath that calm was a quiet excitement, feeling that something big was about to happen. No one talked openly about the audit at first, but everyone knew it was coming. The board members began acting different too. They avoided eye contact, answered emails vaguely, and seemed to be holding emergency meetings with the door closed. Homeowners noticed them whispering to each other in the parking lot or gathering in front yards late in the evening. It didn't look like confidence. It looked like fear. The resident kept to themselves, not out of worry, but because they didn't want to escalate things. They had done what they needed to do. Now it was time to let the process run its course. They checked their emails daily, waiting for news from the state office. When the email finally came, It was simple and direct. The audit team would arrive the following week. They would be reviewing all HOA financial files, board decisions, complaint records. The residents sat back in their chair after reading it, letting out a slow breath. It felt surreal. What had started as a few unfair violation letters had now turned into something much bigger. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't about winning. It was about fair nossiment that had been missing in the neighborhood for far too long. The morning the audit team arrived, the neighborhood felt like a stage with everyone hiding behind their curtains. People peeked through blinds, pretended to check their mail, or just stood outside trimming bushes that didn't really need trimming. There were 2 auditors with clipboards and badges, walking calmly with purpose. They didn't look angry or intimidating. They looked professional, the kind of people who didn't jump to conclusions, but who also didn't tolerate lies. The board members tried to greet them politely, but anyone watching could see the tension in their smiles. The auditors were taken into the small office inside the community center, and for hours, the door stayed shut. People walked by slowly, listening for voices, trying to get a sense of what was happening inside. The resident didn't bother going over there. They had already given everything the state needed. Old notices, photos, emails, and statements from neighbors, all carefully organized. There was nothing more to do now but wait. Late that afternoon, the board sent out a message saying they would be holding a community meeting in 2 days. No reason was given, but everyone knew why. The board wasn't planning a meeting out of kindness. They were desperate. In those 2 days, the neighborhood felt more awake than ever. People who had lived there for years but barely spoke to each other now held long conversations in driveways. Some admitted they had been afraid to complain about the board, afraid of getting fined or targeted. Others said they always felt something was wrong, but didn't know what to do. One neighbor told the resident, "No matter what happens, thank you for standing up. You gave us courage." The resident didn't know what to say except, "You would have done the same if you were in my place," even though deep down they knew most people wouldn't have. The night of the meeting, the community center filled up faster than anyone expected. Even people who hadn't attended a single meeting in years were there, sitting shoulder to shoulder. There was a quiet buzz in the room, kind that comes from people ready for answers. When the board members entered, they looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but in presence. They sat at the long table, shuffling papers, avoiding everyone's eyes. After a few awkward minutes, the board president cleared his throat and tried to speak. "As some of you may know, we had an audit this week," he began. A murmur went through the crowd. People leaned forward. The president swallowed hard. "The auditors found some concerns with our financial records." The room stayed quiet, but the tension grew. People wanted details, not soft words. The president continued there were some irregularities. Some documents were missing, and some procedures were not followed correctly. "We take full responsibility for this." But it was clear from the trembling in his voice that he didn't want to say any of this. It was forced accountability, not genuine. Another board member jumped in, saying they were planning reforms and would improve communication. They spoke quickly, stumbling over their words, trying to control the narrative, but it wasn't working. The homeowners weren't angry. They were disappointed, tired, and ready for change. Finally, someone in the room raised their hand and asked, "Are any of you stepping down?" The question hung in the air like a weight. The board members exchanged nervous looks, but no one answered right away. The silence said everything. Then the president sighed heavily. "We will be resigning at the end of the month to allow for new elections." The room didn't erupt into cheers. People didn't shout. Instead, there was a long, deep exhale, like the whole neighborhood was finally breathing out years of frustration. It felt calm, peaceful, almost emotional. When the meeting ended, groups of neighbors stood around talking, relieved. The board members left quickly, avoiding the crowd. The weight that had rested on the neighborhood had finally been lifted. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. The auditors continued their review, confirming more issues: managed funds, unexplained expenses, and decisions made without community approval. It wasn't criminal, but it was dishonest. And that alone was enough for everyone to demand a fresh start. New elections were organized. For the first time, people were excited about voting. Neighbors nominated individuals who were responsible, fair, and transparent, people who actually wanted to serve the community instead of control it. The resident didn't run for the board. They didn't want power or attention. They just wanted peace. But many neighbors encouraged them to join, saying they trusted them the most. After thinking it over, the resident respectfully declined. They believed leadership should be shared, not placed on the shoulders of one person. They had done their part. Now it was the community's turn. The new board began making changes immediately. They sent out clear newsletters, paired issues homeowners had been complaining about for years, and held open discussions where every voice mattered. The neighborhood slowly transformed into the place people always hoped it would become, fair and welcoming. One quiet afternoon, the residents sat on their porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. A gentle breeze brushed across the yard, and the sound of kids laughing echoed from down the street. It felt like the neighborhood had regained something and had lost a sense of unity, respect, and trust. A neighbor walked over and said, "You know, everything's different because you didn't back down." The resident smiled softly. "I just wanted things to be fair. Now they are," the neighbor replied. The resident looked around, taking in the quiet street, the trimmed lawns, the soft glow of porch lights turning on one by one. It felt good to know the neighborhood was finally in good hands. Not perfect hands, but honest ones.